Welcome everyone to King's Politics. We are delighted to be joined by Richard Tice. He is a politician and a businessman known for co-founding pro-Brexit campaigns, Leave EU and Leave Means Leave. Key figure in the Brexit Party and was a member of the European Parliament until we left the European Union. I guess as regards to what I'll talk about, we'll initially just a few brief questions on the past and then primarily focus on the present and future developments, and then I'll hand it over to the audience if you have any questions you want to put on top. I guess as the first question, what drew you to the Brexit cause? I guess what initial thoughts you found?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So actually 20 years ago, I campaigned hard for Britain not to join the euro, the single currency. So that, and in a sense that was successful, and I don't think we've got much to thank Gordon Brown for, but actually he did the country a real service not joining the single currency. That would have been disastrous for the UK. And I like pushing power as close to the people. And whereas the European Union essentially it removes power from sovereign states, takes it up to Brussels, and it is, in a sense, it's a fig leaf democracy. And I suspected that was proved when I was an MEP there. But fundamentally, I think that sovereign states should have complete control of all the key decisions that affect the people. And so I wanted to basically bring power back to Westminster, and indeed, I'm a great fan of pushing power much lower, a great fan of devolution, push as much power as well. And I hate waste, fraud and corruption, I'm afraid to say, within parts of the EU process. There's a lot of waste and there's a lot of fraudulent spending.
I guess touching on the 2016 election results, I guess did the results surprise you? Or
The 15 or the 16, the referendum?
The referendum?
Yeah.
Oh sorry, not the election result, the referendum. I guess, did the results surprise you? And how about your involvement in the campaign groups? What were you sort of getting from the ground?
So, I was actually always confident that Leave would win, and until the week before, I thought Leave would win about 55-45. And obviously it had been, I guess like all referendums, it had been a tough campaign. And then there was the horrific murder of Joe Cox on a Thursday, it was exactly a week before. And campaigning stopped quite rightly for about 3 days. And clearly that was going to make it a bit closer. So it ended up sort of 52-48. But I was always more confident than other key figures in the Leave campaign that actually we would win. I think I probably spent more time outside London, and therefore I had a sort of a better understanding as to how people were thinking. And it was extraordinary how there was a complete mismatch between what the media, the key commentators thought, what the bookmakers thought, and what most of the people in the city thought relative to actually what we were hearing on the ground.
I guess with the 2019 election, Brexit of course was a huge part of the agenda, and of course the Brexit Party sort of fit into sort of the party politics. How did the Brexit Party position itself, and what do you think the significance of the Brexit Party was in that election?
So essentially, you got to go back a year and a half before. So I set up a lobbying group called Leave Means Leave, and we realised that in the middle of 2018, when we had this Chequers meeting, that Brexit probably wouldn't happen under Theresa May in any meaningful way. So we set up this lobby group, and we started holding big rallies up and down the country, cross-party rallies, 1,000, 1,500 people, and as we approached the March sort of time when we should have left, it was clear that we weren't going to leave, and so we had a plan basically. We had a two-pronged plan to set up a new party, just call it the Brexit Party. Nigel organised that, and we had this lobbying group as well, leading to, in the event there was a second referendum, because in early 19 it was really on the cards that there was a second referendum, and so we had to have this separate lobbying group. But then essentially the mood of the country changed in March 19 when it was clear we weren't going to leave on the due date, and and in a sense, we had the feeling that there would be the European elections, that we'd participate in them, and the rest was history. It was the most extraordinary 6 weeks, probably, that any of us politically have been through. We went from a standing start. 2 weeks later, we were ahead in the polls, and 4 weeks later, we were the biggest single party in the whole of the European Parliament across all the 28 countries. So it was a sort of seismic. That European election, it was a real seismic moment when essentially the people voted on a single issue and said, we want this done. And so that led to the removal of Theresa May. And the moment Boris was elected, from June 19, we started to see our support tail off and the traditional Conservative vote go back to the Conservatives. And that essentially is, we knew there'd be an election at some point in autumn of 19. We always assumed that the Lib Dems and Labour would get together in an alliance and would actually take over the House of Commons, which they could have done. And what was remarkable was Jo Swinson, leader of the Lib Dems at the time, she basically turned down a coalition offer. And in so doing, turned down the opportunity of basically having the Remain alliance at the general election. And all our calculations were that there would be a Remain alliance, and therefore the Tories would have to have a Leave alliance with us in order to ensure that Brexit happened. Because Jo Swinson turned that down, there wasn't that alliance. That meant the Tories didn't need to do an alliance with us. And we were then left with, in a sense, we had three choices. We either competed everywhere, and we had candidates to do that, or we had the choice of standing down against all of the existing Conservatives, or the other option was we didn't stand anywhere. And there were about 4 or 5 of us involved in that decision, and it was a pretty interesting 24 hours making that decision, and then keeping it secret, and then announcing it. And I mean, it was sort of we took probably 2 weeks longer to announce it than many people said we should have done. The reason for that was we had to extract from the Tories a commitment that they'd only go for a free trade deal and that they wouldn't let the transition period be longer than a year. And when Boris agreed that, then we agreed to stand down. That was the arrangement. And what's interesting is if we hadn't secured that commitment, because of COVID, we wouldn't have left. The transition period would have gone on and on. But because it was in law, straight after the election, it's already put that in law, then essentially that meant that we would leave.
I guess I want to start explore more present developments, and of course a major issue recently is the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I guess what were your initial thoughts when Putin announced the invasion?
Well, of course, if you go back, I do a weekly radio show on Talk Radio on Sunday mornings to sort of review the week, and I was talking about Ukraine back in December, January, and Putin kept saying that he wasn't going to invade, and I kept thinking, well, fundamentally the Russian economy is driven by receipts from selling oil and gas, and in assembling all its troops around Ukraine, the price of gas was going up, the price of oil was going up, and he was back at the top table negotiating with the various leaders around the world. And I was sort of thinking, what's the incentive now for him to go in? He's almost got like most of the things logically, rationally, you would think he wanted, which was higher gas prices. So I thought, and I was wrong, that he would keep the troops on the border and just keep essentially commodity prices high, keep the uncertainty, keep the volatility. I couldn't see the incentive of him actually going in. The big question of interesting people's views, is anybody from that part of the world or got friends in Ukraine or Poland at the moment? Yeah, so I guess the thing that the cultural and historic ties between Russia and Ukraine are obviously very deep, and the big question mark is even now is, what's his objective? Where does he stop? And there's a really interesting debate about, was NATO right to adopt the Baltic states when it did 10, 15 years ago? And in a sense, has that acted as a preventative from Putin going in and taking those states back into the remit of Russia, the aura of Russia? So has that actually worked? And if Ukraine had joined NATO a few years ago, would we be where we are now? And that's, in a sense, we'll never know. There are others who have the view that actually, by NATO adopting those eastern states, East European states, the Baltic states, that prodded the bear, and that provoked anger in Putin. And in a sense, we'll never know. You can't read into his mind. All I do know is Putin is not the same man now that he was 15, 20 years ago when the West thought they could do business with him. So something's changed. He will say it's the aggression of NATO. I think my view is actually that it was a good thing NATO went east, because if it hadn't, I think those smaller countries would have been gobbled up by now. But it's we've now got the most horrific sort of situation where I'm afraid things are going to get a lot worse over the next week or 2 weeks. The horrors, the death, the destruction, the pictures in the media, and I support the Prime Minister and NATO's view that we shouldn't enforce a no-fly zone. Of course, I understand the arguments why you should, but the reality is if you do, then you're doing that with NATO airplanes, and you're going to end up very quickly in combat with a Russian fighter, and that means NATO is in direct combat with Russia, which currently obviously we're not. And at that moment, who knows where that leads to? The unintended consequences of war. And I wasn't in the armed forces, but they say that the best laid battle plans always go to pot at the first engagement with the enemy. And so I think it is right that we don't enforce a no-fly zone, that we don't put troops on the ground. I think it is right that we support them as much as we can with everything else. Obviously, the UK has sent anti-tank weapons, which, according to everything we read and hear, have made a difference. But I think what we're also learning is be careful what we believe when we hear media from both sides. Because war is all about disinformation, misinformation. That's part of the nature of it. It always has been. But I think just all we can say is it's going to get a lot worse. The pressure will grow, and this is the difficult thing for the leaders. I think media pressure will go. I spoke to a very senior journalist last night, and he's actually, his view is that it's the wrong decision, that we should be enforcing no-fly zone, and he will write about this over the coming week, 2 weeks, and people like him will add to the pressure. But I think the politicians will resist that pressure. There's no appetite in the US at all. Is anyone American here? There's no appetite in America to put boots on the ground and get involved in another European incursion in the nicest possible way. I think America feels that many in NATO haven't lived up to their financial commitments. And I think that the sort of the real question is, no one wants, obviously, the risk of getting anywhere near the use of nuclear missiles, where that may lead to. So what else can we do to try and essentially change the course of this thing? And my view is that Putin is now so far in this that essentially how does he extract himself from it without massive loss of face? I mean, he's turned Russia into an international pariah, and there's all sorts of questions. How Russian is he? Is he sane? Is he none of us should ever underestimate him. But I think, in a sense, everybody's been surprised, albeit a little bit late, but progress is being made with international sanctions, economic sanctions, and I think probably Putin and the Russian leaders have been surprised by the speed at which those have come in. You know, they are having a dramatic impact already, and I think my view now is the only way this changes is internally led in Russia regime change. That feels to me, I can't say how long that might take, but if the economic sanctions, and I think they should, I think if they get tighter and tighter, and I use a tough word, but essentially economic strangulation, then I think many Russian people will get more and more angry at their leadership. And I think that that may lead to internal change. But how long that takes, the pain that the Russian people have to go through, if we tighten sanctions, we're all going to suffer huge pain. I mean, for example, at what point does Putin turn off the gas to Russia? That's 50% of Russia's, at what point does Putin turn off the gas to Germany? That's give or take 50% of Germany's energy. That shuts down businesses, that means people can't heat their homes. I mean, it's, you know, so there's pain all around, leaving aside the pain that obviously Ukrainians are feeling. So, you know, there's no good options here. The whole thing is awful. It's, you know, which is the least bad option. For me, I think tighter economic sanctions, the oligarchs around the world, particularly in the UK, I mean, you know, we have, without question, been far too accommodating. You know, we've been known as sort of London grad and you know, laundromat. I mean, how many of you know what KYC is? You know, if you want to, yeah, I mean, know your client. It's a complete pain in the backside when you sort of try and open an account, or even if you just want to like go to an estate agent and rent somewhere, you've got to show your references and all that stuff. So you think, well, hang on, if we have to do that, how come Russian oligarchs close to Putin, you know, essentially sort of list companies on the London Stock Exchange, buy 10, 20, 30 million pound houses, sort of, I think a lot of people in the City of London have got a lot to answer for. But I think we've got to tighten the sanctions on the oligarchs. Anyone a Chelsea fan here? One Chelsea fan. I'm a Liverpool fan, that's fine. But, you know, I think, for example, Abramovich he's tried to distance himself a little bit from Chelsea by putting it to custodianship. I actually think we should basically freeze the assets of Chelsea, essentially keep it going, but re-offer it to someone else. A question mark about whether you do the same with the Evening Standard, which is owned by the son of an oligarch. You know, we've got to get really serious, really fast, and really tough. The difficulty for the Conservatives is, you've probably read, but they've taken millions of pounds in donations from Russian oligarchs and relatives. So, you know, Boris made the owner of the Evening Standard appear. So he's probably not really going to want to go for that. And it's pretty, it's in every which way, the whole thing is an absolute horror show. It's a nightmare. It's, you know, the idea that I know I'm old, I'm 57. In memory, we've never been anywhere near this type of situation. Anywhere near. So that was a rather long answer, but it is a big subject.
Yeah, I guess you answered my question about whether we should opt for further sanctions. I guess Zelensky has appealed to the EU, asking if he could, if his country could be fast-tracked into, I guess, the EU. What are your thoughts about that? Is there any, I guess, future?
I think I'm probably the wrong guy to ask, to be honest. Having tried to fast-track out of the EU, Look, I think it's a very understandable request, and I don't know how the EU will respond to that, or whether there's some form of interim membership or temporary membership they can grow. Extraordinary stuff may happen. I think all bets are off as to what may happen. But equally, if they did that, the difficulty is, does that aggravate Putin even more? Because he might say that's a backdoor route into Ukraine joining NATO, and so that it's just these are all the sort of the dynamics of those decisions. And he's essentially looking for any excuse to paint the EU, us, America, and NATO as the aggressor, which clearly we are not. I mean, let's put that absolutely on the table. So my hunch is that the EU will be very circumspect about fast tracking it.
I guess moving on to two more questions about our relationship with the EU and the world in the future. I guess, of course, Brexit did polarize the political landscape quite a bit. I guess even to this day, some may be pessimistic about our future outside the EU. What would you say to the pessimists?
I would say that I'm a huge optimist. The glass is always half full, it's never half empty. And in a sense, bizarrely, the immediate benefits of the independence that Brexit gave us was something that none of us ever expected. There is no doubt that the vaccine rollout and the decisions that the government made in basically fast-tracking the acquisition of a diverse range of vaccines, we were able to do for two reasons. One, because we weren't part of the EU, and two, because they basically outsourced the process to very smart people from the private sector. But coming back to the EU decision, so some will say that legally the EU countries could still have done their own vaccine program, but the proof is in the pudding. Actually, Germany and the Netherlands started down that path and were basically strong-armed by Brussels not to go down that path, but to come back into the fold. And so they came back into the fold, which then the Germans were very upset about, because of course, the Pfizer-BioNTech was essentially, it's pretty much a German creation, that vaccine. So that gave the UK months advantage. I think so that's one thing. In this Ukrainian crisis, actually, I think the UK has basically adopted a seat at the top table, and in some senses has led the way, and all credit to the government on this. Internationally, I think they've been faster than the EU, faster than the US. And again, I don't think that would have been the case if we'd still been a member of the EU. So I think those are two, in a sense, both two unexpected advantages of being an independent nation if you're prepared to take a seat at the top table. We've immediately seen one of the benefits that I wanted, which was an improvement in the wages per hour for the least well off, the lowest paid. But look, I accept, in a sense, there's always challenges, and the nature of a trading relationship between two countries, it's actually never static. Even when you've got a trading agreement, there's always things that are going well, and there's always stuff where there's a bit of bumping and boring, and you have to adapt. The smart thing to do is basically have a series of what I call sunset review clauses. And in a sense, already with the Northern Ireland Protocol, that's essentially where we are. That was, we said at the time in late 2019, we said, Boris, you've sold Northern Ireland down the river, which he did in order to get the deal over the line. And the consequences of that we're seeing now. But in a sense, all of that now is on the back burner because of the Ukrainian crisis.
You have criticised the Conservative Party in recent weeks in regards to, I guess, their taxation policy, referendum with high tax Tories. I guess, what changes should the Chancellor take in regards to our economy, in regards to tax reform?
So I invented a new word about this time last year actually called con-socialists, and it's sort of just beginning to catch on because, and the proof of the pudding is actually you've now got Keir Starmer in the House of Commons accusing the Tories of being the party of high tax, low growth, whereas historically the Tories have always said that about Labour. And we've got a Tory party that is raising taxes, they're not cutting regulation, and higher taxes leads to lower growth. And lower growth means lower wages, less tax revenues in the medium term to invest in public services. So we're the only people with an agenda to cut taxes hard for the least well off, the lowest paid and small businesses. And when I say hard, I mean, so we would lift the personal tax threshold from £12,500 a year to 20 grand a year. That frees up 6 million of the lowest paid from paying any income tax whatsoever. That's 30 quid a week, which makes a real difference in net take-home pay. So, and the thing is that Conservatives historically have always been the party of cutting taxes, lower taxes. And the economic theory is, and a couple of your economists, the economic theory is if you cut taxes, then actually you'll get higher growth, you'll get higher wages, and in the medium term, sort of 5 to 10 years, you'll get much higher tax revenues. And the evidence I'll give you is, take Australia. So, whilst we've got the highest taxes now for 70 years, we've got the lowest growth forecast for 60 years, and the highest government spending for 50 years. Our total tax take as a percentage of the size of the overall economy is about 35%, rising to 36%. Australia, they're down about 27, 28%. America's about 25, 26%. If we'd seen the growth in the last 15 years in the economy that Australia has seen, the compound growth, every single year, our tax revenues would be another 150 billion quid. That's another NHS that I could give you every single year. That's the compounding power over the medium term of growth. So now, someone will say, oh yeah, but Australia's different, they're a commodities-based economy. To which my response is, hang on, so are we. We've got the North Sea and we've got a couple of trillion quid's worth of treasure under the ground called shale gas. So we're actually a commodities economy. And we've just chosen currently not to use it. So, and the other key thing is, between the two world wars, for 30 years, we had total national debt in this country over 50% higher than the current debt levels. So, with higher interest rates. So my argument is that the Treasury and the Chancellor, they are unnecessarily worrying about, in a sense, increasing taxes. And the reality is, they tried this after the financial crisis in 2010. They thought they could tax the way out of the crisis. And actually, we ended up with austerity. We had pretty modest growth. And lots of people say that's austerity. I say what they're doing now will lead to austerity Mark 2. And cut taxes hard, you'll get higher growth. And actually, the government's balance sheet can absorb the short-term, in a sense, borrowing that will involve, can easily absorb it, easily. So that's what they should be doing. And apart from that, you should be cutting out the wasteful spending. I mean, there's tens of billions of wasteful, incompetent spending. So yeah, I'm a tax-cutting guy, but equally with sensible constraints. So within our policies, there are elements that you would say, hang on, that's deeply socialist. So I would nationalise all of the public utilities, electricity, heating, water. Actually nationalise 50% of it, and 50% should be owned by British pension funds. It's part of our critical national infrastructure. It's not right, and we're seeing this now, a sovereign nation being dependent on someone else for critical elements like energy. So you've got, I mean, we're not dependent on Russian gas, we're exposed to it through the world markets, but, you know, Germany is completely vulnerable, as is Italy. It's not right that the biggest single owner of our public utilities is a Chinese billionaire with close links to the Chinese communist regime. It's completely awful. They could turn off the electricity in the southeast of England and London for 8 million people overnight, there's nothing we can do about it. That is strategic madness. And that's what free markets allow to overreach themselves. America and France, they don't allow overseas ownership of critical national infrastructure without specific approval. We have no constraints on it whatsoever. And that's awful. And I've been talking about this for months, but in the last 2 weeks, there's been a massive wake-up call. And even Labour don't want to nationalise the utilities. So, but I think it's the right thing to do, and it would actually cut bills.
I guess as the next question is, with Brexit, there's this idea of global Britain, I guess our relationship with the wider world outside the EU. What does global Britain look like to you?
At the moment, we're seeing it day to day. Global Britain means that the UK government has got a seat at the top table of international relations, international negotiations. And that is, in a sense, that's part of what, when we were campaigning, we said, we need a seat back at the top table. Obviously, we'd much rather a seat at the top table of calmer things like negotiating trade and talking about the environment and these sort of issues. But yeah, global Britain is about looking after the strategically critical things, some of which I've just touched on. Welcome free trade, but within sensible constraints. And I just fundamentally don't think that allowing overseas ownership of our critical national infrastructure is a smart thing to do. Interestingly, for example, in Scotland, anyone's Scottish here? So Scotland, their water is a not-for-profit company, and it's no coincidence their bills are about 10% lower than average water bills in England.
I guess a criticism of our relationship outside of the EU is the idea that we have struck around 69 agreements, trade deals with other countries, but majority of them are rolled over. I guess, do you have concerns that the Conservative administration might not leverage its position outside of the EU?
I think actually, Liz Truss was making progress in negotiating trade agreements. Obviously, she's been distracted, but that's an ongoing process. And but I think the other thing of Brexit that they haven't done at all, that they absolutely should do, and we all sort of committed to do, is cutting regulation. I mean, I'm a great believer in smart regulation, not daft regulation. The EU produced reams of daft regulation, and the Tories should have been cutting that hard ever since we left. Now, granted, COVID clearly the big distraction, but they should have made more progress on that. And I mean, some simple things. How annoying is it when you get all these pop-ups on your phone, consenting to an app or a website with GDPR regulations and all that stuff? I mean, completely mindless, totally unproductive, but very expensive and totally unnecessary. GDPR for small businesses, for small charities, is just a cost and a burden. That's unnecessary. In the City of London, they've got a huge piece of legislation called MiFID II, which is utterly, it's great for big banks that like compliance departments, but a nightmare for small growing businesses, disruptors, and so things like that. In the insurance world, there's another thing. So we've got to be cutting daft regulation and keep the smart stuff. And that's a really important part of being able to grow the economy faster. And everything, the more you grow an economy, the real winners in terms of higher wages are the least well off, the lowest paid. And the real losers of the higher energy bills and the higher taxes are the poorest in society. And I mean, you take the Chancellor's current stance. Instead of cutting taxes, as I suggested, he's doing the opposite. He's increasing taxes on the poorest by freezing the personal tax threshold. He's going to drag another 1 million people, the lowest paid, into paying income tax over the next couple of years. And I think that's awful.
I guess this will be a final question before I give it to the audience. You're of course the leader of Reform UK. What does the future of the party look like?
So launching any new brand in any walk of life, whether it's in academia or anything, is challenging. trying to launch essentially a new political brand in a pandemic is clearly challenging, and first past the post is challenging. But we've got, I've talked about cutting taxes, smart regulation. We've got quite a different perspective and a different offer. And in the next general election, there'll only be 5 parties who are standing candidates all over England, Scotland, and Wales. We won't stand in Northern Ireland, and we'll be the only party with a hard agenda to cut taxes. The only party that actually is campaigning in healthcare for something that most Western nations take for granted, which is zero waiting lists. Most nations don't have waiting lists. They look at us and say, what on earth are you doing? Waiting 6 months for a knee replacement, for God's sake. So zero waiting lists, why aren't we bold, ambitious? But to do that, fundamental reform is required. Just going back to tax, we've got the longest tax code in the world. It's over 20,000 pages. It's 4 times longer than Harry Potter. I mean, it's awful. Healthcare, we've got to reform that. And then on energy, we've got to completely reform our energy policy. We all care about the environment, and we all want cleaner air. I've got an electric car, I love it, it's great. And I'm installing solar panels in my business interest. So, I'm doing my bit, but the government's net zero plans will impoverish the least well off, and actually they will impoverish the young the most. It will create the greatest burden of blight on the young, because it's going to make businesses completely uneconomic, and energy costs. We're at the foothills. We're like at base camp of Everest in terms of the cost of net zero. And the higher the costs go for energy prices, then the more jobs and our money goes overseas. So I'm talking a lot now about the treasure that's under our ground, shale gas. A couple of trillion quid's worth, that's our national debt. So again, we'll be the only people campaigning for using our shale gas. There's new technologies, you can use it extract it in a new way, and then you can use carbon capture to put the CO2 emissions from gas-fired power stations. You can actually put them back into 2 miles down into the rock using the reverse technology of shale gas extraction. So there's some exciting stuff there, but we've got to have the courage to talk about that. And those of you who know anything about shale gas is one of the sort of the current process that people use is called fracking, and the environmental lobbyists that very successfully campaigned to stop it, guess where they were funded by? Russia. There's now evidence that Russia funded the environmental groups who campaigned against fracking, not just here but in other European countries. Why? Because Russia wanted to continue to sell gas, and the last thing in the world they wanted was Western European nations having cheap gas, which would reduce their need for Russian gas. So in terms of reform, we'll be the only party, unless others change their policy, and I very much doubt it, campaigning for smarter energy policies as opposed to the current net zero trajectory. And the thing about the current net zero trajectory, look, I say we want to do our bit, but the current plans is doing the wrong bit at the wrong price in the wrong time frame, and it's the least well off and the young who will be burdened and blighted the most.
So I'll give it to the audience, so if anyone has a question, please put your hands up. Sorry.
If you'd have been in charge, what would you have changed about the Brexit deal?
So, say again.
If you'd have been in charge, what would you have changed about the Brexit deal that we ended up leaving?
2 aspects that we criticised. One was fishing, and the other was obviously Northern Ireland. And that might have led to no deal. But there might have been a tighter last-minute compromise. But those are the 2 things that were bad at the time, are still bad. Both of them are resolvable, and I think should be resolved. On fishing, there's a 5-year period, and then basically we can have a complete renegotiation, and I think we should do. And on Northern Ireland, obviously, if we get over this Ukrainian crisis, then I would be invoking Article 16. And the thing about the whole, we all get deliveries at home, and you can track your parcel on your phone, you know exactly where it is. from the moment it's left the depot to the moment it gets to your house. You know, that technology existed for all of the trade that went from Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland. What happened was, straight after the Brexit vote, the then Taoiseach was a guy called Enda Kenny. He said, with goodwill and the use of technology, we can sort this out. He left office. He was replaced by Leo Varadkar, and the whole issue was completely hijacked and taken down a different direction. And the results was all the pain and grief that we saw. So those are the two things.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question?
So I think you're right in saying, I'm right in saying that you would want to hold some kind of a net zero referendum, and it just seems to me like an entirely unworkable, vague plan, which would then be entirely unenforceable.
In terms of the process of having a referendum, or the debate.
What the question would be, and then which legislation it would actually cover.
Yeah, so we do think there should be at the moment there's been no debate about net zero. I mean, in Parliament talked about it for 90 minutes and then did not hold a vote. 90 minutes, committing the country to net zero. And then without any more debate, they actually upped the targets. So I think there should be a national debate about it. And given that it's going to change the type of cars we drive, the type of way we heat our homes, the type of food that we're going to be asked to eat, how much travel we can do, this affects everybody's lives and lifestyle. So I think that we should have a national debate. And I think there should be a referendum. In terms of the question, it's a very fair point. The people who set the question is the Electoral Commission, and they should be tasked with setting the question. And obviously you've got to keep it simple. But at the moment, we're almost not allowed to have a debate. If you try and have a debate, you're smeared and labelled as a denier and a sceptic. I mean, I've sort of been there. I've got enough scars on the back from Brexit and from being against lockdowns during COVID. So what's a few more scars? But I think the key point is this affects all of us. So let's have a proper, grown-up national debate. And likewise on shale gas. Actually, given what's happened, it has to be back on the table. The analogy I'll give you is, imagine inheriting the house from your parents, and there's a cellar, and in that cellar is a box of treasure, right? And the value of that treasure is the value of the mortgage on the house. There's one drawback: the cellar's locked, and your parents lost the key and decided they weren't going to get a new key. I think most people would say, I'm going to try and get a new key to get the treasure out of the cellar because it's like the value of a mortgage. And the value of the shale gas that we all own, all of us own it, so we've all got a vested interest. It's the value of our national debt. So you talk about cutting taxes and benefiting the least well off. It's really important. Now, let's have that debate rather than essentially refuse to have it. So yeah, I want a referendum, I want the debate, and I think it could potentially, if we have anything to do with it, it could become the central issue of the next general election.
Next question.
So I think everything you said about high growth economy and liberating, that on the low cost base is really credible and really exciting. Actually, it would bring much needed innovation and kind of shake that up. I guess coming from my perspective as a woman who has 2 young kids, I guess my question would be: it seems to me we're sitting on a very latent asset in our female workforce, many of whom can't get back in to use their full potential, to leverage their full capacity to contribute to the economy. So I guess my question would be, how would you propose to liberate that latent asset that the country has? Because I think, to kind of coin a phrase that you just used, that is sort of a woman's issue, but it affects all of us because it is such an untapped, reserve for our economy?
No, it's a great question, and tell me if I'm wrong, but so the last data I looked on this was that actually not only the percentage of everybody in some form of work has been growing in recent years, over the last actually 7 or 8 years. And I think within that, the percentage of female workforce has been growing. So look, I think progress is being made, but your point is, I think, quite reasonable. There's still a lot more that can be done. And actually, of course, if there's any benefit of COVID, and in a sense there isn't, but one of the things that I think we learned from it is the ability to work from home. Clearly is a massive advancement, and different companies will adopt that in different ways. But for those sort of office-based, I think that almost like the norm will be, okay, it's 2 or 3 days in the office and 2 or 3 days from home. And I think that, for example, women, young children and things, that's a huge opportunity that should hopefully be much easier to take advantage of and leverage. And I think most employers recognise that. So in a sense, and maybe that ends up being the biggest lesson learned from COVID. And with that comes things around technology, broadband speeds, everything. I mean, you're probably pretty good around here, but in many parts of the countryside, broadband's still a nightmare. But does that help?
It does.
Next question.
What do you think about the government response to the pandemic?
So the pandemic, look, the first few weeks, the whole thing, it's a nightmare throughout. Unprecedented, hard to know. They should have shut the borders earlier. And when I got concerned was about 3 or 4 weeks in, when I recognised that there was no plan really to come out of lockdown, and that the collateral damage of all the other things that we're now learning about, and some people are expressing surprise about. God, cancer diagnosis have collapsed. Children's education has collapsed. Mental health, absolute huge crisis. All of these things actually became self-evident pretty quickly. So I became very critical of that very early. Again, it was awful, trying to put your head above the parapet. It was, and then there was the thing called the Great Barrington Declaration, which was announced in October. And the complicit mainstream media, when I supported the Great Barrington Declaration, I was cut off numerous times on the media, just not allowed to talk about it. But actually, more and more people now say, actually, that was the right thing to do. Of course we're going to make mistakes. I just wish that our politicians had the courage, really, and they still haven't really done this, to say, look, we're going to get some things wrong, we'll learn from it, try not to do it again, but we're doing our best. Instead, you have this mantra, we're following the science, we're taking the right decisions at the right time with the right science. And actually, I think a lot of people got fairly, more and more people realised that that just didn't stack. Be honest with people. But I think at the moment, with the Ukraine crisis, I think politicians, people like Ben Wallace and Boris, are being much more honest with people. We're not going to send NATO into Ukraine. So yeah, I was a big critic, and there were times, I got stuff wrong, but the collateral damage from it, I'm afraid, will be with us for a very long time.
Next question.
Hi, I would be interested if you could elaborate on the reform that the NHS would need to undergo to eradicate
no, great question, thank you. And it's very easy to say, of course, it's much harder to do. But fundamentally, our NHS, let's be very clear, of course, it would always remain, healthcare should always remain free at the point of delivery. But the thing about the NHS is basically it rations care. And whenever you need it, you're told when you're going to be lucky enough to receive some care. So whether you get a GP appointment in 2 days if you're lucky, or 2 weeks, that's their decision, not yours. And likewise with a consultant or an operation. Our plan is simple, and actually we've run it by lots of GPs and surgeons and people. And my deputy is a guy called David Bull, who was a doctor, worked in A&E for a long time. So it's very simple. If you can't see a doctor in 3 days, you get a voucher, you can go private. If you can't see a consultant in 3 weeks, you get a voucher, you go private. If you can't get an operation in 8 or 9 weeks, you get a voucher, you go private. But fundamentally, what you've done is you've put the power in the hands of the consumer. The consumer is in charge, the patient is in charge. And what will happen is that the non-NHS healthcare sector will grow massively, very quickly. And lots of retired medics will come back part-time to work for non-NHS. Working in the NHS, is anyone doing medicine, or is anyone doing work part-time in the NHS? Right? The thing about the NHS, on the front line, it's great, but it's a management nightmare and very bureaucratic. And lots of people tragically leave it because of that. And lots of retired medics would like to go back and work part-time and things. So the capacity will grow. Far too many NHS operating theatres are used 12 hours a day, 10 hours a day, 5 days a week. For heaven's sake, they should be used 24/7. And that's what this would do. And very simply, the rough cost of it, simple maths, 5 million operations, 3 grand a pop, that's 15 billion. Now that sounds a lot, but in the context of national debt at 2.3 trillion, and what you could do, for example, with shale gas, I know this sounds glib, but actually, we could get NHS waiting lists down to 0 within 18 to 24 months. At which point, I would say to you, 15 billion is like a large round of drinks in the overall context of what it does for the nation. The improved productivity, the confidence to give people, the self-belief, and once you've got it there, it'll stay there. And so that's a sort of, I've simplified it obviously, but fundamentally, you put the patient in charge. And we polled it, 81% of people are quite happy to go further, to be treated and to have their pain relieved sooner and earlier. And if you're looking online and your local hospital, you can't get a hip operation for 6 months, 50 miles down the road, you get one in 2 weeks. By hook or by crook, you'll get 50 miles down the road. That's the bottom line. If you're in agony or you're in pain, you'll do it. And that will drive waiting list down.
I guess this is the last question, so go ahead.
Following up from this question, is the voucher going to be fully paid for the whole operation, the whole?
Yes, yeah, it'll be the same, absolutely. And what you do is, so yes, it's still free at the point of delivery, but what you do is what the government does is negotiate tariffs, a schedule of tariffs with the private providers. Initially, you would make that a bit generous because you want the private provision, the non-NHS provision, to grow rapidly, to create that capacity. And what will actually happen is you'll get consultants who currently work 5 days a week, and they know what they're going to earn. They'll say, right, for the next 6 or 9 months, I'm going to work 6 days a week, and I'll go and do operations over there. And they'll earn a bunch more cash. And that's why the capacity will grow very quickly. So yes, the short term, there's a financial cost to it, of course. But in terms of the benefit to the country, it's a no-brainer. And sorry, just finish. It's an extension of what Tony Blair did in the 2000s. So the NHS could basically buy a lot more private capacity, and they got waiting lists right down. What we're saying is rather than the NHS make that decision, the patient should make that decision.
We'll feel one more last one. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I'm just circling back to your answer about the possible net zero referendum, and I don't think it's you, because you presented sort of the net zero referendum and the shale gas as sort of two separate things, but I don't think they're they're based on your interpretation of the shale gas and the possible carbon capture. I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
You're right. No, they're part of they're part of a big national debate that needs to be had.
So you could still have net zero, but use the shale gas with the.
Correct. Now, and I haven't got the calculation answers as to how quickly you get there. If you use shale gas and the carbon capture technology is good enough, then I don't know the trajectory of that.
Yeah,
But you're right, it's all part of one debate.
Yeah. But then my question is about the sort of the morality of the net zero referendum, or the potential net zero referendum. If you think it's fair for one current generation of voters to decide possibly on effects that are going to disproportionately affect people who will not be able to vote, or could possibly impact people in other countries as well.
I think firstly with referendum, I think you should have them every 15 years. So, for example, on proportional representation, we had one in 2011, so we should have one in 2026 to cover that point. Likewise with the EU, I have no problem in having a referendum 15 years after the day we left. And on something like net zero, I think what it does is, and in a sense with technology evolves, it never stops evolving, so you've got the opportunity to see. And I just think with what we haven't got is a diverse, essentially the government put all their bets on electricity. That's what they're doing. All the bets on electricity, mainly driven by renewables. And the issue with that is it's never good to put all your bets on one, become dependent on one thing. So there's no investment in tidal power, there's very little investment in these new small modular reactors. There's a bit, but not enough. There needs to be more investment in hydrogen. We don't know which technologies will move at which speeds. I'm a great believer, invest in all of them, but fundamentally, gas is there, it's cheap, it's affordable, and that should be our core, and you shouldn't ditch it rapidly. I think that's the big debate we should have. And then should have a referendum. What a referendum will do, and this is what I hope, it will force the government to, I think it will force the government to adapt and be slightly more balanced in its approach. That's what I think. And as I say, I'm a great believer. I'm investing in electric car chargers on some of my industrial properties. I'm investing in solar panels. I would quite like the solar panels to be made here in the UK, not made elsewhere. The ones I bought, we don't make them in the UK, so I bought them from Spain.
I think that's all we have time for today. Can we have a round of applause for Richard Tice, please?